Hello everyone, today we talk about late medieval English tactics. As I know by experience, many of you are interested in this topic and or expecting from me a complete browsing of the same. Telling you the truth, it's not the first time we discussed this. As you understand, late medieval English tactics as a topic immediately revolves around the say, English tactics of the 100 Years' War. Henry III once, say, patronymically speaking, given that the system that came to full maturity under the greatest, the military genius in English history, surely the most complete, the most effective, even more than Marlborough, left a very important mark in the art of war. I will say this, this video is against any cliche, but I can tell you one straight fact right away that in no other, it's simply a mathematical observation. There is no other army in history, like the English one of the 100 Years' War, that scored so many victories in condition of symmetry with the enemy, because essentially medieval England and medieval France were materially, technologically the same country, in the deep conditions of inferiority, numerical inferiority that the English normally were in these tactics, which makes, at least based on these metrics that are relative, the English army of the 100 Years' War is the strongest army in history, meaning that no other army could score these records on such a regular fashion. I say this first and foremost for a very simple reason that the older date followers surely know, because I discussed this multiple times, that I am extremely critical, in spite of what I just said, of the entire historiographical attemptive explanation that has been given to this. In other words, as we will understand today, even though this video will be basically segmented in 3 episodes, I will explain now better how and why. Today we talk essentially just about why the English began to fight that way. Then we will talk about the longbowmen and in the final episode in men-at-arms. The average explanation of this has consistently been and remained, at least especially in pop culture, technologistic and extremely biased in favor of the notion that the longbow was some sort of special weapon, and also that the English were basically fighting the way they did for some, let's say, doctrinal, we can say in some anachronistic sense, reason for which they had simply to fight dismounted and using tactics that for some reason they would have sorted out, magically sorted out, and that the enemies were sort of too dumb to cope with, and or that were basically wrong and bringing them just to lose. Also, since, and I know this on YouTube, everybody has an opinion on this stuff, and people, generally speaking, feel that the need to express their own thing, I will say this, because I've been criticized that I do not have a bibliography on the videos and that, whatever. So first of all, just to begin with, my channel has made an extensively large amount on videos on this topic. I cover the entire medieval warfare by every single polity, battle, unit type in depth. I made thousands of videos on basically all these topics. So that alone would be enough for me to just say, look, go look what I said about this or that topic, where I actually also discuss primary sources and beyond. I have been vocal about this topic also, historiographically speaking. I will give you just 2 titles so that if you're interested in the general perspective that I expose, and I'm not the only one to expose that goes a bit against the perceivedly mainstream, which is a term I hate, notion that you still hear being perpetuated, reverberating on the internet. Bradbury, Medieval Archery, and especially one passage by Hurley, Arrows Against Steel, that reads, quote, "Judged on the basis of projectile velocity, accuracy, and range, it will be seen that the crossbow was at least equal to and possibly the superior to the best hand-round composite bows or the English self-bow. I will, of course, extensively discuss these topics. Again, I already discussed things like, the use of the longbow or the composite bow. It's in Renaissance warfare. We talked about missile warfare a lot as far as the Middle Ages are concerned. We talked about different battles of the 100 Years' War. I have an entire reconstruction based on primary sources of Poitiers. That is an incredibly, it's possibly one of the single most beautiful battles that I've ever reconstructed, masterpiece of the Black Prince, that actually as beautifully explains how basically there is no evidence whatsoever that the longbow was anything like the crossbow, but an auxiliary arm in combined arm tactics. Of course, that was necessary in the war, but definitely not providing apparently any edge to the English that can be considered as decisive or determinant or this other kind of positivistic, deterministic terms for their notorious battlefield success against the French, and not only. I also talked a bit about the 13th century English army. We talked fairly a lot about Edward I. We made a video about the Battle of Stirling Bridge. We talked about some 100 Years' War, and especially Wars of the Roses battle in the same level of depth. We talked about the French army of the same period a lot, so you have lots of videos to compare. Also, what I'm going to specifically discuss on these very topics, that is going to be my broader presentation on the issue, right? Otherwise, there is, again, medieval missile warfare, and even medieval archery playlist on my channel that contains most of the stuff takes into consideration. For example, also the Italian armies of the same period were dramatically advanced missile-wise and combined armed tactics-wise. The reason why I make this premise is also that the way I deal with this topic may be perceived as some kind of criticism, as it is to an extent, of course, of the mainly sort of Anglo-American narrative of the story that was habitually and understandably more focused on the 100 Years' War, the English armies in particular, and in a glorious time, in fact, of English warfare that, as I explained at the very beginning, absolutely deserves the fame, the reputation, and the success that is credited to it, which I'm not going to take away, nor I have any reason. Again, I love the English armies of the period, especially the ones of the second half of the 13th century, the first half of the 14th, but there is in fact a legacy there that the English lived upon, especially against throughout the course of the rest of the 100 Years' War. I am often critical of some aspects, say, of Anglo-American sort of historiographical approach, not because I have anything culturally or morally against it, but because it is the more known, it's, say, in the world, the one that left the greater impact, just also out of merit. In continental Europe, we didn't study military history in the last 80 years as much as the Anglo-American world has done. I've discussed this aspect also specifically elsewhere, also with other YouTubers in videos that you can publicly watch. I'm just fixing the, again, more popular and mainstream and simplistic and technologistic, deterministic, positivistic explanation that runs wildly rampant. I, for example, criticized a video by Shadiversity explaining sort of medieval tactics in a lens that is incredibly biased in that sort of English longbow, more than longbow men-at-arms combined sense, and you can immediately see it in a very strong way to restore the actual and the objective quality of the English armies of the period, meaning that the reason, to make a long story short, why the English armies were so effective was not having the longbow or the crossbow or whatever, or dismounting or whatever. It was leadership, morale, a state that really rocked by medieval standards that, in fact, sadly, with the end of the Hundred Years' War, the English defeat was also in part lost. You know that England lagged behind, starting from especially the mid-16th to the mid-17th century to continental military development. That's another story. We also talked about Tudor and Stuart warfare on the channel. This mini-series is dedicated exactly to dismantle most of the notion that basically was the longbow that made the thing, and that basically there is some certainty about even how these battles fundamentally unfolded, right? I have, as you know, over 14,000 books about mostly military history and really lots about the Middle Ages within them, mostly of this sort of Anglo-American background that in some cases are very meticulous. The ones I cited before are actually, in fact, more accurate and more in line with, in fact, my interpretation that I matured also thanks to them. Others are quite disclosing and very famous. I don't want to talk about a person that passed away just a few years ago, but if you, for example, look at Jan Heath's work at large, you will find not just these kind of mistakes, but at the same time and that's the actual problem, most of this publishing. Great work in many ways, in others really less, mostly because of the lack of a comparative and diachronic approach, meaning that, dedicating an enormous amount of research and information to, in this case, like, for example, English or British warfare, for example, and very few to other countries that were much more, say, even to the Celtic French, right, disproportionately more to, say, parts of Italy, for example, is very weird, and very often it seems like more like a compilative thing, having mostly look at those sources just to provide that kind of nominal information that mostly that Wargaming research group series was interested in, without an actual interest in the art of war, right? At the end of the day, warfare is fundamentally about that. It's fundamentally about testing the respective systems on the field, having an idea of what was happening in the meanwhile, pretty close elsewhere, also in countries that were pretty connected with this. So be aware that, unfortunately, we do not live in a world that, regardless of this this enormous amount of digitalization, the incredible ease in finding information, etc., is, as a result, well-informed at all. All right? And I do what I can on YouTube. Of course, my channel's format is not very popular, but these topics, I think, must be discussed very seriously, and not as still very big, the biggest sort of military, self-styled military history channels do, that is basically, are just basically continuing that to perpetrate a bit that mythology, very often to them, like the medieval art of war stops to the 100 Years' War, in terms of, every army in medieval history must be, just throw an example, English armies of the 100 Years' War. That's not really a random, unique, sort of conventional, habitual example, right? Much bigger things, but also happening elsewhere that is not normally discussed. These people do not know that, because sometimes this stuff is really not even researched or published, or maybe done so in English. So there is always this skepticism, mostly based on what, that narrow pool of scholarly sources say, without knowing that there are many academias in the world, and actually also much better ones than some, to tell it all, and that we haven't really that complete and objective picture of the medieval art of war that this, again, very often positivistic and sometimes even still technologistic explanations would like to make you believe. And there are lots of historians that present their work like saying, look, I found this new explanation, and not just, it's not a new explanation, but it's not even a good explanation. And the person doesn't even understand it, nor, of course, the people that normally follow them. As I said, today we will fundamentally analyze how and why the English fought the way they did. I could make a further premise of how and why I think they did what they did, but we will simply look at some statements and fundamentally criticize them, sort of even correct them depending on, because mostly it's not like the fundamentals are, not understood or made up, but they are framed in a way and sort of bent towards a direction that do not really help their more objective art of war meaning and understanding. We will also talk about the herce controversy, which I will make an entire video on its own. More of that later, but you know what the herce is in the 100 Years' War and specifically the English tactics of the period's history. So from one side, it's undeniable that England's victories in the 100 Years' War stemmed almost, by the way, exclusively from the strategic integration of longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms. Banally, and I'm not kidding here, if you look at all these disclosuring texts, the longbowmen are normally mentioned always first, right? Even just in terms of mental order. Why is that the case when the men-at-arms were literally the most important and actually decisive element in the clash? It's already something that may stem from that sort of gentry, sort of national exaltation of the longbowmen as potential third estate ally of the monarchy against the nobility in later times, when also certain historians, we're talking the Tudor era, for example, made up a bit, at least tried to explain why the English armies won in certain battles of the 100 Years' War, giving explanations that, frankly, did not just fit the word of the era, but were weirdly taken by modern scholarship as some sort of accurate or reliable explanation of what, for example, the herce really was. I sent, by the way, strategical and not only tactical, because as we've seen in videos about, for example, the composition of the English armies of the 100 Years' War, especially for the sake of the chevauchee raids, the combination men-at-arms, longbowmen was not, of course, merely the product of some sort of doctrinal, tactical insight that existed in a vacuum. These armies found themselves to fight larger pitched battles while still operating in a broader theater, also in different and smaller operations for different strategic purposes that, again, stem from the organic of these armies, the politics behind them, how they were subsidized, who commanded them, etc. That's a complicated side of the story. Again, we also have an entire series about medieval armies organization that can shed some light on this. We will go back in time a bit, looking at the prehistory, why, again, the English armies arrive at the beginning of the 100 Years' War the way they were, all right? And the explanation is, again, not positivistically doctrinal. It's not like the English kings and commanders simply thought that the only way they had to fight was in numerical inferiority with dismounted men-at-arms and longbowmen on the wings, rather than, as we will see now, interspersed across the line or in front of the same men-at-arms, just for the sake of it, or because for some fashion they decided they had to fight like that. I will also stress that Western European warfare in particular was very homogeneous in this time in history, and so that people that have a bit of a broader horizon in the comparative tactics of Western Europe know that, in fact, it's even just through practice with the sources and the reconstruction of battles through the same, cannot really ascertain that the English were just going for that specific array and formation just per se. It is true that it will become a habit and that it would be particularly successful, but we have to dig a bit deeper in the military logic of that and the general background of English military history. It's also true again that the English fought like this pretty much in more or less every open field circumstance. We know much less about, of course, smaller engagements that were quite important, and I would say there is this sense, even in this disclosure in books, that there is the big pitch battle that is often described as, oh my god, they were so rare. And honestly, I specialize in tactical reconstruction, and I must say that when you actually study an entire period in the history of war in a specific region, it turns out that expeditions, battles, etc., were actually more frequent, and engagements between at least armies ranging in the thousands were not that infrequent. It's just that they were often not detailed enough from a tactical point of view from the accounts for eventually historiography to focus on them. But the notion that even the bigger pitch battles were particularly rare is not accurate. This also stems from the prejudice that medieval warfare was just, let's say, revolving more than others around siege warfare. This is actually very true for most of the ancient and the modern era. It's been a bit too grossly exaggerated for reasons that I will not explain, but trying, in fact, to accentuate, to subjectivize, to accentuate this particular time in warfare from the rest of the art of war, which does not really help in the broader interpretation. And that the smaller engagements that would have been so many and just skirmishes actually also do not quite add up very much as an interpretation, in my opinion, because why skirmishes? Actually, most of these skirmishes were even consistent clashes that probably would have seen similar tactics employed to one of the larger battles in the tens of the thousands, that may have been, in fact, rare for this period, but, for example, that weren't rare at all in other parts of Europe. In fact, the 100 Years' War, as I was saying before, shouldn't really even be taken that much as necessarily the forefront of the art of war at the time. It was a big deal. It was very important. Again, the English armies were really cool, but they weren't really the only thing happening in Europe, nor this necessarily the most advanced. Right, and here we could even digress in terms of material culture, technological development. Northwestern Europe wasn't necessarily even too dramatically ahead, for example, in arms and armor production and all this stuff. And in part, the fact that the English relied on longbowmen had a bit to do with that, but we'll explain this later, proving, in any case, that, in fact, we're not technologistically biased here, and that, of course, you can win, as the English did, so often with an army that is using, again, by approximation, they weren't particularly backwards, but for example, like, why would the English care so much about longbowmen, apparently? The easy answer is that it is what they normally had compared to other pools of recruitment, and mostly having the Celtic Fringe that was very underdeveloped by Western standards, but in this sense providing with more people willing to go fighting abroad, as it would continue also from the same region later on in history. You understand the social balance here, like what is it really in between the men-at-arms and longbowmen. There were other heavy infantrymen that were not noblemen, as a matter of fact, and that did contribute to stem those French cavalry charges. Let's not overemphasize the role of the longbowmen that were indeed very important, because there were many, especially compared, if you look at the indentures ratio, men-at-arms, longbowmen, really a lot, but in this sense diluting the relevance of the single longbow to, for example, how to a crossbowman, like it could be, for example, in the French armies, and that have often been, look, they lost, look at Crécy. Well, they were in numerical inferiority, were often in some other conditions a disadvantage. that's not really a fair comparison. There is no real, and even less with alleged replicas or experimentation, historical evidence that the crossbow was worse than the longbow. The same notion, not because it had higher rate. Well, the crossbow had actually a higher range for that matter. So, and they were also similar in terms of overall performance. And as I cited before, there are scholars that absolutely think that there isn't nor a definitive proof the longbow was superior. On the contrary, they lean towards the notion the crossbow in general was superior. In any case, the most important thing from the perspective of the art of war is that if you read the sources of the battles, that of course are the literal only thing that we have on how things really happen at the time, they don't give a blip about this missile auxiliary weapons, right? There can be a notion here and there, mostly from battles like, Azincourt, but with very conflicting account about the war. Before I mentioned Crécy regarding the longbowman versus crossbowman encounter, that is often taken, Crécy shows the superiority of the longbow. How if we're talking about, for example, like, the Genoese being in numerical inferiority? And already about that, like, how do we calculate in the absence of absolute quantities? As still we can't do really in contemporary, for contemporary battles, what factor really made it, which is often just like a compound of the thing, and definitely not the notion that a weapon per se is better than another, which doesn't obviously make any sense. So there is none of that from the sources. For the Battle of Poitiers, we've seen actually how the only indicators for that masterpiece and that great English victory, that the longbow was not even that effective against the French protection. And still, of course, by combined arms, eventually the English won again. And again, the sources do not care about longbow, and they care about basic principles like, morale, leadership, flank attacks, the regular, say, alternation of the battle lines in combat, that at the end of the day is truly the single most important thing that you should look at in the reconstruction of these battles, and that people reduce to things to like weapons without even knowing what the actual sources say. Like, the first thing that a historian recognizes is that if you talk about that topic, it's because you literally have never studied the sources. You have literally never reconstructed the battle from the actual sources. It's just hearsay. And we all recognize that, even just from the phraseology, in the way these prejudices are perpetrated and repeated. History is a serious thing. It's not YouTube videos, it's not hearsay, it's actual work and actual competence and actual months or even years spent in gathering all the sources available, studying them in the original language, trying to make sense, looking at the terrain, finding all the information possible and trying to come up with a solution that is logical, that respects all the classical principles of the art of war. And it's something that really requires a great deal of work and background. And I'm sorry to say that, but reading books or watching YouTube videos or whatever has literally per se nothing to do with that, right? So let's be extremely clear. Having played video games, having read Ospreys, having participated to Facebook history debates or whatever, has nothing to do per se. Like, you can have that, right, and being competent, but per se it has nothing to do with being competent in the topic. Like, literally zero, right? It can be useful to get a bit of references, of having an idea of how certain concepts work, but the reconstruction of the battle from the entirety of the sources through a very careful strategic analysis is really not exchangeable with any other alleged proof whatsoever. There is equally no doubt that the English armies were quite effective on the battlefield during the 100 Years' War. They scored some of the most famous, important, and tactically admirable victories in late medieval warfare, right? So tactics are the product of an army's quality. However, they're not simply pre-packed modules that simply win the battle per se, right? I do not want to digress on very important theoretical concepts about the art of war, but battles are fought engagements, right? We come from decades of de-traditionalization, whereby, especially because of the post-Vietnam War syndrome, we want to find the ideal model to kill the enemy without getting dirty with your hands, and sometimes like imagine that there is simply that easy way through out of combat that simply happens by changing one thing and the enemy being dumb, right? So that as if somebody sorted everything out and the others for some reason didn't know how to fight. Warfare is not about that. Warfare is much more tendentially symmetrical than people often imagine, because the outcome is the product of a wide range of factors that by definition cannot be reduced simply to one, right? Saying that, for example, one tactic, even a combined armed one where you have multiple arms in the sense cooperating, is per se just the making 50% plus one in terms of how things work, would not explain why, for example, the other side at that point wouldn't say, well, we just can't win, and change and adapt as it always happens. This is often sort of overlooked as a general prejudice because it's a very easy thing to think that it's just that factor, and it's something that individually people feel often in search for feeling personally validated, right? If they have the quick, easy answer, they think that they are smarter and more capable, and actually that's just a product of incompetence and lack of hard work and general mental laziness, as well as basic ignorance. Warfare structures you in a completely different way, even if you just studied as a military historian. And you know perfectly well from these battle accounts that are very explicit about this, how hardly fought these battles actually were, right? I would say in general we should stop thinking, as we've seen in many battles, that people get defeated simply because they are incompetent or basically bad at war, made some bigger mistake. When in my experience as a military historian, I must say that it's extremely rare to study a war, a battle, etc., and realizing that one of the sides was just not good at what they were doing, right? There is no credible evidence of this. People in general fight following, even in the normal development of the art of war, some so-called more or less conventional way that, of course, is hoping to catch the enemy in a condition of inferiority, and so tending toward the asymmetrical, but having, in fact, especially the bigger the engagement is bad luck in that sense, meaning that the bigger the army, not just more difficult it is to keep things together, but in this sense, more balanced are the odds, which is beautifully showed by also the major battles of the 100 Years' War that present with a great question mark. It is to say, really, however, why did the English win so often against very big, and in that moment actually superior, meaning that they were generally objectively advantaged, competent French armies, right? They were well led and generally speaking, were organized. But we have seen how actually there was a greater disorder from the French side for reasons that are civilizational rather than, and political, of course, like moral, rather than connected with the actual tactics that were carried out. In other words, how the French were dealing with English, while varying during the 100 Years' War, did not simply change in a radical way, nor the same English armies would end up really adopting such unforeseen or unprecedented ways of fighting that weren't generally appreciated, and also by their enemies in other contexts, in other times of their military history. So I would think that, conceptually speaking, it's very important to start from the realization that, for example, the same, capacity of dismounting and fighting on foot is not inherently innovative, special, or even particularly recommendable. And in fact, it stems from the big, as more or less constant datum here, that the French armies were numerically advantaged, and the effect of dismounting from the English side was not much a matter of, again, okay, we're happy about that, but mostly a precaution, due to the fact that if you have a particular disadvantage, especially at men-at-arms, it doesn't really make much sense to go out there in the open and try to break through the enemy. It has an advantage in the attack that cavalry, so the mounted men-at-arms, were conceived for and were remaining as such during late medieval warfare. Other big misconception is that basically in late medieval warfare, everybody began to dismount and infantry reigned supreme. No, right? Actually, from the mid-14th century onwards until the mid-15th century was a refeudalization of warfare, including actually a coming back of cavalry, both organically and tactically, that is notorious, right, in the Western art of war. And for some reasons that here are, for example, political, cultural bias, mostly the notion that the Renaissance approached some kind of modernization and improving of the individual, of the modern person, of the Reformation, that where people were reasoning more freely and that they were more individually autonomous. It's completely wrong. Like, I discovered that like half of the West literally has no idea that from the 14th century to the 18th, the Ancien regime basically checked the communal development of political, military, and social autonomy. In other words, infantry, the liberty of the communes in later medieval times went down, all right? And it remained down for centuries like this. And there are literal adults who believe that this is not true, that basically there was a gradual improvement of infantry, first of all, a progressive, linear, just increase in infantry force, which did not happen during late medieval times. It mostly like went big down and then rose up gradually, and mostly from, say, just the mid-15th century from the Swiss model. That would be also quickly surpassed by more combined arms of especially like big monarchies that really controlled those commoners and that weren't really getting anything particularly more out of that. I'm not going to comment on this. England, by the way, during the 100 Years' War was a bit an exception of the previous sort of infantry victories that had occurred, especially in the first half of the 14th century, that stopped with a crisis. Basically, commoners and peasants did achieve very important victories against the same English. Think about the Scots, but they stopped by the mid-14th century. And England not just is an exception because their armies continued to go on with infantry victories, but because, of course, these infantry victories were not led by commoners or peasants. In other words, the notion that the longbow did that also in a broader cultural, social sense is BS, right? The English armies were a monarchic creation and a professional system run by noblemen. And the infantry, say, is very often here, of course, like the combination of men-at-arms and commoners, the latter of which did not have the upper hand in the system. But again, as I said before, just the fact that in this disclosuring books, the longbow is named first compared to the men-at-arms is conceptually telling you how distorted the perception of all these political and social phenomena really is. And it is really bad, because studying how this happened really shows you how, for example, advanced the English monarchy really was. And in developing that military system, and the simple notion that, was just, the lower strata of the population increasing in importance for some liberal myth of modernistic infantry revolution or that stuff is just honestly a childish and incredibly ignorant overlook of the entire political, military, and social history that we're also dramatically well aware of, historiographically speaking, and that, in fact, this simply does not hold up and shows how inconsistent much of this incredibly self-referential historiography that is practically also not studied anywhere else can get with this topic, and showing you how, again, badly informed about the rest also European warfare and its own, right? The same, in this case, the same one of the 100 Years' War really is at the end of the day. Ideally, you should have studied the entire battles roster of the 100 Years' War, which is a very big thing to do. Probably a lifetime is not enough to do so, but it can be done if you just specialize in that. And I personally do not know at this point any scholar that has done that. There are some names like De Vries, for example, it passes as the super guy who studied this stuff. I look at his work, I can't deny that it inspired me when I started my PhD, but at the end of it, I already consider it basically garbage, and I'm extremely honest about that. Because simply there is no method of tactical analysis in his battles reconstruction, and that's, I think, pretty self-evident. Just as the even more checkable fact that he simply does not know the rest of European historiography on, in fact, late medieval infantry warfare, which is something that I'm also going to publish about, highlighting what are we even talking about? Like, why would you just tackle a topic, or hopefully tackle a topic about, the development of combined arms, pikes, pavises, crossbowmen, and when you look at, the single arms existing historiography, you deliberately do not insert in the bibliography what has been studied in other countries by this point, which offers also pretty valuable insight on what was happening. That's the kind of self-referentiality that I am discussing. Now, as I was saying before, I already made some videos about 13th century English warfare that is probably one of the single most fascinating and overlooked chapters in English medieval warfare that explain why essentially the English would come up with this, for example, this evident predilection for archers as opposed to crossbowmen, because the English developed as a feudal country crossbow units, right, in their armies, pretty much like the rest of Western forces during especially the second half of the 12th and 13th century. This is the first step, not even just why, for example, the English fought with, especially the men-at-arms, dismounted, because normally the archers were already fighting dismounted in the bigger engagements. My take, especially looking at England after the loss of the main French possessions after the Battle of Bouvines, underwent some process of Britannicization, so to say, that, as you know, sort of peaked in the campaigns of Edward I in Wales, Scotland, parts also in Ireland, that entail at some point the recruitment of lots of forces from this very French. For example, why were there so many Welsh archers in the English armies of the 100 Years' War? Bradbury, for example, brilliantly shows that there is no historical proof whatsoever that the Welsh archers were anything better or worse than the English ones, right? On the contrary, we find that the English archers in the English armies were paid more than the Welsh ones. There were also some certain particular woods that quite famous for their archers, and the general notion here is social. I mean, as we explained before, the Celtic French was poorer. If the English had to recruit troops for campaigns at large, they could gather large amounts of tendentially poorer infantrymen coming from that French that, in this sense, tended as light infantry to be archers, right? Because the crossbow also has now, it's not like there weren't crossbows, I don't know, in Wales or like also in the rest of Britain. Just there were less, the crossbow at that point was mostly associated with more communal burgher troops of some sort. The notion is that aside from the south, that was more French influenced and so closer to civilization, the rest, England in general was a bit more primitive, especially the Midlands, still relying maybe on more foot troops simply because, I don't know, they were less socially stratified. In other words, the elites were poor, and so, for example, they could afford less horses. This is the same reason why the Scots, for example, had lots of infantrymen, so that their armies were virtually just on foot with just few horse. Nothing special, nothing doctrinal, just they fought with what they had, right? The average Scottish farmer there that could afford mostly just a spear, because they weren't by majority pikemen. This is also particularly normal. People would like to read into that some, I don't know, structuralistic doctrinal reason. Oh my God, the Scots had found out this way of fight. No, you just measure the social stratification of Europe and realize less affluence, poorer elite, less cavalry. It's that simple, really. And if you saw all the European countries compare in this sense, it would be sort of self-explanatory that any kind of projection of why they fought in that way would simply disappear. And this is the same reason why the English of Edward I, for example, began to fight the Scots by softening up their schiltron, their heavy infantry formations, with archers. Why? Because they had archers at hand, lots of them. They were fairly cheap. They had less crossbowmen for the aforementioned reason, because England did not have this explosion in communal development. It was importantly feudal and rural countries to that point. Again, the Celtic French being in particular underdeveloped at that time, Wales being de facto incorporated in the Kingdom of England. And so you have also in this, for example, the Wars of Scottish Independence, this type of tactical combination, mostly due to simple organizational reasons of manpower availability. What kind of troops do you have? These, as I was saying before, it's not what kind of weapon you have, but basically how much you want to kill the person in front of you. This is what warfare basically gets down to. That's how the English and the Scots fought against one another. So especially the English habit of fighting with dismounted men-at-arms and this greater amount of archers and missile troops that are expression of poverty, because normally other countries in Europe would have some more notable heavier infantry type between the men-at-arms and the lighter missile forces, developed from essentially the lessons learned on the battlefield against the Scots during the early 14th century. And probably also a bit before, as we've seen for example, for the Battle of Stirling Bridge. In any case, engagements like Bannockburn in particular revealed not really the futility of cavalry charges per se against steadfast, thickly packed spear-wielding infantry, but the need to rely on a more, let's say, locked combined arm tactics that could help, in fact, softening up that spear wall. Leading, by the way, the English to adopt, some people say that the same Scottish method of having their men-at-arms fight on foot. I disagree with this. I think that this is not something that you need to copy from the Scots. Like, it's not like the English were dumb. They met the Scots that also, why did the Scots fight like that? We just explained that, because their cavalry was so poor compared to the English one. It actually was pretty good, that they fought mostly just like infantry to mostly exploit defensive positions, because very important aspect of the story, the early 14th century infantry armies, including the ones winning battles against cavalry, did not advance. All right, before the Swiss in the mid 15th century, the point of heavy infantry capable of standing their ground against cavalry was that they could actually move, advance. Of course, they were able, this throughout all the art of war, infantry could always move, go wherever they wanted. For example, before the Battle of Bannockburn, at some point there was a Scottish infantry detachment that parried an English attempt of outflanking the Scottish position. But that's strategical, all right? Tactically wise, when this happened and infantry had to meet cavalry, they had to stop and stand very firm, all right? That was the only way to meet a cavalry charge that also normally, and I will stress this, normally charged into the pikes, because the pikes were the only weapon capable of stopping cavalry charges. They could, of course, be complemented, as we've seen here, by missile support, but that was an auxiliary function, right? The guys who stopped cavalry were the heavy infantrymen, all right? And with pikes, halberds do not do that. Golden ducks do not do that. That's for when you have already stopped the cavalry charge. With a pike, somebody enters the ranks, and when the cavalry stops, that's in a very dangerous position. You just go down at the heavily armored man with it. What happened for different reasons in the first half of the 14th century is that the communes and the peasants were so strong in a broader civilizational sense that they managed, through the same means that they had always met cavalry before, normally supported by cavalry, that was the decisive arm, to stop cavalry, right? After the mid-14th century, the Fourth Estate is, the Third and Fourth Estate are broken by the Black Death, so you do not see this kind of victories, if not in very individual battles where terrain was incredible. We're talking either ambushes or something that are not the typical pitched battle, where literally frontally you have, infantry stopping cavalry, right? Until the mid-15th century, you do not see anything like that. And actually, you do not see anything like that ever more, because in the mid-15th century, you have the Swiss advancing, right, for the first time, giving so much collective training to an army composed by the majority by pikemen, which was unseen before. The ability to essentially take the enemy by surprise, by outflanking, whatever. And again, that Swiss model that was essentially based just on the pikes stops because combined arms take over. It's pike and shot later on, and things get more complicated. Made lots of videos about Renaissance warfare. But to say that actually second half of 15th century infantry warfare, first half of 14th century warfare are not just separated by 1 century of cavalry dominance, but they also have nothing to do with one another in terms of infantry tactics, because they're two completely different things, right? One is offensive, the other is defensive, and they literally pertain to two radically different times in the history of Western civilization that destroy any kind of linear increase in infantry power. right? That's also usually the monofactorial interpretation. These were all combined arms systems, right? Even in the early 14th century, when you have infantry only armies, like it had not been seen for a century and a half before winning over cavalry, that does not lead to any kind of infantry military development later, right? Those systems die politically and socially. There is a refeudalization of warfare, and in the mid-15th century, just the Swiss, that are quite unique in many ways, come up with that, and then princely states in Europe start copying that model and adding combined arms. They have nothing to do with the peasants and the communes of the early 14th century, right? Without mentioning that were even stronger infantries than the ones of the early 14th century before and after, and during and after, that for obvious political, military, and social reasons did never abandon cavalry and always used cavalry in their combined arms method. And so that also defied this notion that we're talking about the entirety of you. Actually, these were just fringe areas. We're talking in also sparse events, like in Flanders. In Flanders, they basically just win Kortrijk. In Montpellier, it's a so-so thing. Then up to Guinnegat in the second half of the 15th century, the Flemish get annihilated by French feudal cavalry-based armies in an incredibly shocking series of constant defeats of their infantry-based armies. The Swiss so-so mostly exploit the terrain. The Scots do well. The English do well, but they are, again, a monarchically led system that scientifically decides to basically fight with this system, also because of, again, the more or less what they already had by themselves. We will also talk about Scottish warfare, Scottish armies, but as I just explained, even there was nothing special in terms of, any particular tactical alchemy. The Scots were poor as hell. They were barely a feudal country, becoming just during the Scottish Wars of Independence. They had scarce cavalry in general. They had lots of infantry. That's how they fought, right? There's really no other explanation. So, again, the English were incredibly competent, and when you have so much infantry, that also presents problems. They understand that they can operate with combined arms tactics. At some point, they score actually pretty important victories against the same Scottish infantry. At some point in time, they get brutally defeated by the same, but again, it's not as this alternation by itself just proves a determinate system, right? Either the one or the other system being the winning one. No, it's about the contingent situation, right? In any case, it's obvious that if you have to cope with lots of infantrymen, and you realize that your cavalry shock element is even in combination, so as a wall with the rest of the army, enough to break through, you will have to cope with that enemy differently. Again, in my opinion, it's not like the English at some point decided that they had to fight, for example, like as the Scots did. They just adapted in every single circumstance to that. Also because, I would like to stress, the English men-at-arms do not display by any cultural, personal, opological, social, technological point of view any difference whatsoever with the other European men-at-arms who regularly fought on horseback. All right, it's true that in the later part of the 100 Years' War during the 15th century, men-at-arms across Europe tend to dismount more, and we will explain now why. But at large, these men-at-arms were designed everywhere, England included, to master cavalry combat. All right, it's not like the English army of the 100 Years' War said, okay, well, now whichever fight, on foot, because, this is just the period in which we have to do that, and I don't need a horse. These guys were always designed to actually and hopefully fight mounted, And as I said before, most of the times the reason why they dismounted to fight is that they were in numerical inferiority, and they dismounted because they literally were mounted otherwise, as they wanted mostly to exploit the defensive in actually pretty dire tactical situations. We have seen how, again, the Battle of Poitiers is excellent, and it perfectly shows how the French had cornered the English in also pretty tough terrain. And again, they found themselves there. They decided to dismount to exploit the terrain features and bet everything on the defense, also with some kind of counterattacking capacity, which was led on horseback, by the way, the flank attack by Capital de Book. So just for saying, right? There is no doubt, however, that the Scottish Wars of Independence were formative experiences for the English. They surely experimented with this dismounting, with this infantry-based tactics, and they surely as fully matured that in combined armed tactics, basically meaning what? That the synergy between the two arms was sublimated in that specific fashion, so that the longbow in particular, that was particularly prevalent, as we've seen, was ever more enhanced. Basically, the same English king, they're talking mostly like this increase in the, you know, that there is no such thing like a longbow as a distinct type of weapon. In Western Europe, the bow was made everywhere in the same exact identical way since prehistory, and there was never any difference whatsoever anywhere, right? The longbow is just like literally a bigger bow by size, mostly based on the archer's physical capacities. Longbows are used literally everywhere in Western Europe by everybody in the previous centuries, always. Right? The Spanish had it, the French had it, the Scandinavians had it, the Germans had it, the Italians had it. They all used this. At large, when the crossbow comes around, it's much handier, easier to use, more effective also in open field. At large, it's more or less the same in terms of archery performance than the longbow, as we will see. If anything, the English, again, have more archers, and especially the monarchy decides, also for countering a bit the nobility that, as you know, since the Magna Carta was a bit too oppressive for the English king's tastes, to intensely train, for example, during seasonal festival competitions, etc., the English gentry in the use of this weapon, which is not a broad militarization of the country that also in a feudal country would have in fact not been looked upon positively even by the monarchy. The French, for example, literally lose the Italian wars because they refused to exploit their vast demographic resources that would have allowed them to beat the Spanish infantry had they created a native one of their own, because they rightly feared a revolution, which in France tends to happen rather often, as also the Jacquerie after the French defeat at Poitiers really shows in 1356 and the following years. So basically, the English monarchy allows for the enlargement of a specific recruitment pool of these archers that, telling the truth, are also not so dangerous, in the sense that as we just explained, the archer is a light infantryman, right? These aren't heavier infantrymen that can stand their ground against cavalry. Archery does not do that, right? Even as we will see later, when the English archers use stakes to fix on the ground, aside from the fact that you can't always use them, it's not that there is not a deterministic or technologistic okay, now we just fix stakes on the ground. We would have never thought now to stop cavalry and the French knights, get impaled on that. This is not how war works. I don't know how to explain that. Even the accounts of Agincourt that are sort of the most graphic about that are actually full of enormous question marks and actually pretty big red flags, including the fact that the French forces on the wings were radically understrength and unprepared, so that not just they arrived on the to fight against the English wings, but they literally, like the same longbowmen were equipped, or at least some of them, equipped with heavier weapons that would turn them into heavy infantry, basically. So that lots of mythologies developed from, again, a poor accounts read. And in this sense, the archer is not so dangerous. It's not like hordes of archers can take over the country, right? The cavalry would basically run over them, which is literally what normally happened if these guys were caught in the open by cavalry. But even just heavy infantry would be enough, all right? If you want to defeat archers, heavy infantry goes there and obliges them, if anything, to leave the ground. And that's why heavy infantry is by definition superior to light infantry, because heavy and light infantry are defined in relation to one another, literally whether they can hold the ground or not against each other. So this was actually a pretty convenient kind of political, social, and tactical organizational mix. Yeah, you have a handful of elite troops like the men-at-arms that were really impressive, the peak of professional forces at the time, and missile troops that historically are, again, an auxiliary force, and together with, in fact, the heavy element of the men-at-arms can do a lot. And in between, as we've seen, there actually are some other heavy infantrymen, because the men-at-arms alone numerically would have not really been able to simply even hold a line. I mean, if you define especially men-at-arms a bit as the knight by approximation, then there would have been other forces, some retinues equipped with, again, pikes, bludgeoning weapons, that as normally any other European army was made up of. The English seem to have had, again, less heavy infantry combined in that composition, and more archers. And actually also, again, if you study the indenture, I made some videos on that organic composition, you realize that there were actually a lot. But I mean, we're talking even thousands of longbows for sometimes even just tens of men-at-arms, which means, by the way, that in order to be effective, and by the way, the indenture, always remember that if you ever study that, or the condotte or whatever, just know that it's not by studying an indenture contract that you actually know how these guys fought, right? The indenture is just a contract for some soldiers to be hired, right? And armies were composed organically in very different ways. So it's not like literally, in that case, tens of men-at-arms and thousands of longbowmen simply took the field with that combination. Which is also interesting because it tells you as if, basically these men-at-arms didn't want even to be challenged by these men. And they could even ideally take them on because they were just light infantrymen. Plus, they would have found somebody else. For example, in France, the Gascon infantrymen, as we've seen very often, the English armies of the 100 Years' War are actually Anglo and even more Gascon, numerically speaking, forces. And the Gascons were, again, in the average of Western European forces, maybe with a bit more of lighter forces like the Bidault, those kind of stuff. But again, fighting with heavy infantry. So this enormous difference between also England, France, other parts of Europe is actually non-existent. They fought pretty much all with the same combination. You just have men-at-arms on horseback that at some point dismount. Why? Because they are in numerical inferiority, they are cornered, they also on bad ground, they decide to exploit the defensive, and that's how they go. Had they had the upper hand, they would have actually fought mounted, right? And there is a way to corner the enemy, obliging him to take you on, right? The defensive is quite important in many ways. And there is also another reason why it's sort of more popular in late medieval warfare. The first one is that by the mid-14th century, and for, in fact, another century, armies shrink in size dramatically. Universal powers shrink. money shrinks. Everything shrinks, and armies are smaller. When armies are smaller, terrain becomes more important. All right. There is also a professionalization of the system. The communes, the peasants are exhausted, right? And so armies are actually composed by ever more elite professional forces that tend to be heavier, right? And that, in this sense, tend to be also a bit more difficultly dislodged from the field in relative tactical terms. In the 13th century, actually, armies were much cooler, more powerful, all right? You had, tribal lines of literally thousands of heavy cavalrymen that charged one another, were so punching. You had massive infantry wings that outflanked. This was extremely more powerful, extremely more numerous, extremely more dynamic. Nobody talks about that. Again, there is this bias that the top in the art of war was English armies of the 30s. Not really. The great medieval civilization, including English armies, were things that occurred a century before. All right. The fact that England was much more at war, especially abroad in the later period, naturally brought Israel to concentrate on that, especially also because of the big victories. But just be aware that just talking about that makes the expert in the art of war extremely suspicious that you may literally have never studied anything else in the art of war, even think that was actually even the top of it. That's not the case, all right? Just be aware of that. Was at this point longbow warfare mastered by the English? Yes, but why? Because it was longbow? No. Had they operated with crossbows, it would have been the same. As in other armies across Europe, the mid-14th century again witnesses professionalization. The longbowmen are fundamentally professional soldiers. They're also individuals who are particularly well trained for longbow use that, as we've seen, requires constant training. But longbowmen never surpass their condition of light infantrymen, of missile troops, right? In the art of war, they never are anything more than crossbowmen were in other armies. There is no evidence whatsoever that the missile element or an auxiliary forces like this was in any way decisive whatsoever. I would like to stress this, that there is no actual evidence throughout the 100 Years' War, in the endless battle accounts of all this stuff, that tells you that the English ever won just because they had longbowmen, or that this was the most important factor, again, the decisive one. None of that, right? History is much plainer, simple, clearer than all these elucubration. So, by the way, why the English eventually field the typical battle formation we'll describe today? Well, because that was the standard way such troops were normally deployed. Spoiler, the herce is today very well understood as simply like a two-pronged formation. That is to say, the normal sort of wings capable of enveloping the enemy when and if possible, because the enemy had wings as well. It's not like these sort of different teeth distributed across the line, these pockets of longbowmen ahead of the men-at-arms that defies military logic, simplicity, combined arms, like the preferential deployment. And in fact, did people study other European armies, was always having these missile troops on the wings, right? This happened from quite a while, especially the 13th century provides with overwhelming evidence of this. This continued ahead. So you have a normal battle line in 14th century armies with men-at-arms in the center, normally mounted, by the way, as it was typical. Like in all the other countries, this was going on as normal, including like kicking infantry's rear, as we've seen with the Flemish, by Franco-Burgundian armies. and auxiliary, basically infantry forces, not just missile, by the way, on the wings. It is true that in the mid-14th century, heavy infantry that, aside from men-at-arms, dismounted men-at-arms, tend to shrink, right? And that, as a consequence, missile troops remain, so increasing in importance overall in relative terms in the, say, in fact, men-at-arms, other infantry ratio. There were, as we've seen, in all European armies, including the English ones, other types of heavy infantrymen aside from the men-at-arms, especially pavismen in other countries. But that were, by the way, they had nothing to do actually with covering the longbowmen. That's another, with the archers, that's another, the crossbowmen, for example. That's another big myth. Pavismen, or pavisiers, however you want to call them, were fully fledged heavy infantrymen, very often very aggressively used in assaults, etc. Right? So we will have to explain there why they were like that too. I already made some videos about pavismen, so if you're curious, you can check that out. Again, the myth that there was a guy holding the pavis while another guy shot from the rear, that is also not a historical thing. It's a complete invention. There were, especially in siege warfare, more stationary shields, covers, etc. You could fix the shield on the ground, but the notion that, for example, 1/3 or 1/2 of the non-men-at-arms infantry were guys that simply held shields with no other function in the field doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's not documented. It's not a real thing. It's a myth, a very popular myth, widespread myth, unfortunately, still. Right? But in other words, the herce formation, we'll see it better now, is nothing but a normal European, winged battle line that the English simply field like any other army. All right, there is nothing specific about how the English fielded their troops. Not just other Europeans at some point will have their men-at-arms dismounted. This had already happened many times because men-at-arms knights do dismount often. We saw other battles and this was the case. Some say that already in the Anglo-Norman tradition there was a tendency to dismount more frequently than, say, I don't know, in France, in Western Frankish warfare. Again, as a broader Northern European bias, it is plausible in a tendential way. I described this in other videos about English warfare, but if you look at 12th, 13th century English warfare at large, ever since the Normans held sway in Britain, the English do not lag behind in terms of feudal warfare. They have very strong knights, they have very good crossbowmen. So there is nothing, for example, in the 13th century that suggests that the English had any consistent bias towards more foot combat, for example. Again, it's possible that the Midlands, some parts, again, of Britain were poorer, and therefore there was some kind of more primitive way of war there. But tendentially, if you look at the English monarchic army, it's in this period a very updated and very developed force, right? It's also very well organized. The English are, especially during the reign of Edward I, very well prepared for wars compared to other parts of Europe, and there is no actual evidence of some kind of substantial organic difference or any particular tactical bias that differentiates them from it, right? So what happens in England is actually, again, not much just of a willing choice, but just a habit. Again, you're inferior in numbers, you have to fight on some kind of more broken terrain, the defensive, you dismount. And the way you fight is simply the same old men-at-arms battle line, which is now composed by, again, dismounted men-at-arms rather than mounted ones. They had their horses, by the way, behind in case of need, and the other infantrymen on the wings. Every single Western European army fights in the same identical way. Right? There's nothing special whatsoever. And I'd like to stress this actually emphasizes, right, highlights the quality of English armies, because if you realize that they were actually much more similar to the other European armies, in order to explain why they won, you simply have to realize that they were better. That, as we know in Clausewitzian terms, is a matter of moral force. And it's also, again, lots of other things, leadership, luck, tradition. Von Clausewitz tell us pretty well that without luck, nobody can win, right? Without even one of these factors, you may easily lose, all right? And there is no mathematical way to say, this factor, this other was actually decisive, because it's just simply unrealistic in a physical sense that any factor individually counts as 50% plus 1. And this is just like an enormous sum of factors, of which people want just to isolate a tip of an iceberg. And so saying, this is because of the longbowmen. Okay, you immediately know that that person does not know anything about military history. Immediately, right? This person is immediately ipso facto disqualified from any competence in the art of war, right? This is what every expert in the field knows. So, surprise, surprise, dismounted men-at-arms, battle line flanked by units of archers and or other troops, by the way, as well, that could be also together with men-at-arms in the same battle line, is the most famous setup consistently used throughout the war. There is a notion, by the way, that has, I don't want to get out of sort of the 100 Years' War, but I noticed a historiographical bias in other countries as well towards the notion that the wings, the battle line wings, would have routinely or normally have a forward-angled predisposition. This is a very common mistake. There is basically no evidence of this either, for the simple reason that the wings normally had to engage with the enemy wings, first of all, which is often overlooked because, again, the focus is mostly on just one army and the rest does not exist. Like you study a formation and you don't consider what kind of formation it has to fight with. It's pretty weird. And again, this alleged particularism of English formations is not there, right? Normally armies who study like how it had happened in previous generations always had wings, and the wings fought against one another. And the purpose of these wings was auxiliary in the sense that the men-at-arms bit the hell out of them, of each other in the center. In the word, the heavy infantry. Then you had these wings that sometimes are heavy infantry too, but lighter. They have less punching capacity, especially when, again, men-at-arms didn't dismount. They're cavalrymen, so actually they're superior as the mounted arm to the infantry. As generally speaking, by the way, across Europe, even in the first half of the 14th century, when there are all those infantry-only victories, actually cavalry remains the upper arm, right, the stronger arm. It's not just because they're defeated, even a consistent amount of time, that actually the majority of the times cavalry is defeated at all. And actually, if you study the broader European picture, realize that, yes, people were impressed by these infantry victories, but it's not like that it changed the way of war. Just erase that from your mind. It did not happen, right? Throughout late medieval warfare, consistently, regardless of different, as we've seen, ups and downs in terms of the cavalry-infantry ratio across Europe, cavalry is dominant. It remains dominant. It does lose ground. It is true compared to the immediately previous period, but it is in charge because it's still in charge in the establishment. The mid-14th century revolts are brutally repressed everywhere. There is no such change whatsoever. The ancien regime is established, and it's over for half of a millennium. So that's why you have also in perspective like the importance of these wings as something subordinated to the men-at-arms, because the men-at-arms were regularly mounted, right? So the purpose of infantry was to fight against one another, like against the respective wings in the front, and if one of the two sides won, they could close on the enemy men-at-arms flanks and hopefully overrun it. And this is normally how it happened. Also when the men-at-arms were mounted. So this is a very well-known tactic. There are lots of battles when this happened. The best ones in absolute terms were the Italian ones at different times, also because they had the larger armies, the sort of the better infantry, and also the better documentation. So that also if you look at the infantry victors' tactics of the early 14th century, they're real amateurs compared to even just the subordinate Italian infantry wings, right, to subordinate cavalry, and never make the mistake of considering, again, infantry alone just an indicator of ease of some sort. Like if you look at the Scots, at the Flemish, at the Swiss, they were actually desperate in the way they fought just with infantry. They were, especially like if you look at Flanders, it's the most famous example, they were rebelling to feudal authority. Right, in Scotland, it's just as we've seen, because feudal authority was weak. They had more infantrymen, but they were subordinated to those men still. The Swiss are also not really carrying out a real revolution in Switzerland. They have also fairly small armies. So, and as we've seen, the English still fight instead with men-at-arms ingrained in this infantry army to a very consistent level. So they are even the most exceptional of this. In fact, non-really communal peasant base, right? The English keep fighting with the feudal professional model, just tending towards dismounting. So it's was infantry. Infantry does not per se equate to lesser social elements, right? When you are a dismounted man-at-arm, you're an infantryman, but you're not a guy who smiles upon the third or the fourth estate. You're somebody who, especially in England, lords over it, which is pretty important to understand when evaluating English tactics as well. And also when you consider this as against the French, oh my God, they were fighting the nobility. Not even. I'm not claiming that anyone really does that, but the French stereotypically in that sense pass for the sort of the posh, snobbish kind of, we're the noblemen. And I don't know, for the English side, they're literally the same identical people scoring those victories as well. So England is also the definitive example that the infantry victories actually go nowhere in terms of social reivindications are concerned. In other words, we understand this English arrays were basically the same ones that, in fact, also the French, when they will start dismounting on different occasions, will identically look like. Again, this dismounting was not proper just of the English. It's something that happens also across Europe during especially the mid-14th century, but cavalry is also just the preferable setup used in Western Europe, and for good reasons. Right? We don't look at this from the other side. We've seen it in different battles. For example, Courtrai, for example, the Battle of the Golden Spurs. It actually shows a solid French competence, and de facto an almost quasi-victory from the French side. Right? Just the hidden reserve of the Flemish behind the main line that was actually broken by the French cavalrymen. Even if they had crossed the canal, they had been again struggling against Flemish resistance, they had managed to break them. Right, so it's also to show that there is nothing conceptually revolutionary behind all this. It was not the same normal way of fighting, except in the sense infantry managed in very strong defensive position to get the upper hand on attackers that were still about to break them. So even if that, especially the Battle of the Golden Spurs, is really epoch making per se, ideally in many ways, not only, as we explained, the Flemish do not go anywhere, they're beaten until the end of the late Middle Ages in a striking amount of incredible defeats by knightly armies on horseback, but they also literally had been fighting like they would, like any other infantry would have fought at that point, right? And even not in such a sophisticated way. Again, there were much better infantries still at the time that for political and social reasons were perfectly integrated with the men-at-arms, and they didn't even think to, in spite of their absolute strength, to fight against those, because they still, like, actually they were quite useful against their enemies and beyond. So let's be very careful not to conflate just politics with war, with society, because they're overlapping, and they all incarnate, let's say, in the various armies, but these are different peoples, different backgrounds, and you must know them before understanding these battles. And that's why, again, most people just stop to, it's infantry versus cavalry, right? In his chronicle, composed between 1357 and 1360, Geoffrey Le Baker notes that the English had grown, quote, mostly accustomed to fighting on foot, imitating the Scots ever since Stirling. Stirling, in this case, actually refers to the Battle of Bannockburn in Le Baker. So we have these statements that are important from especially sources of the time that understood better the picture. However, the same Le Baker elsewhere contradicts this same statement of his by stating that Halidon Hill, the Battle of Halidon Hill, marked, quote, the first battle where the English men-at-arms fought on foot in conscious imitation of the Scots, right? We are decades later. Thus, you see here even just the general confusion, like what does this mean? It's obvious that the English had been fighting for now generations against the Scots, all right? So there is hardly ever more a powerful hybridizer of cultures as potential destroyer than war itself. Again, it's not like the English and the Scots radically differed in a broader civilizational picture. Yeah, it's true, Scotland is not a civilized country. Let's be honest about that. And England is very advanced, but by medieval standards, like in absolute standards, again, they're very similar countries in our eyes, right? Despite this inconsistency, evidence suggests that the English began dismounting as a general practice by the 20s of the 14th century at the latest, meaning that surely this happened at some point before. The Lanark Coast Chronicler records that this practice started specifically in 1322 at Borough Bridge, and Froissart recounts that during Edward III's 1327 campaign against the Scots, the English were, quote, ordered to dismount and take off their spurs and drew up in 3 lines. These are contemporary sources. I also made a video about Froissart, that is definitely the most important medieval French chronicler, even though he was Flemish himself. And as you know, he's a very famous, the prominent source for the 100 Years' War, French, Franco-English warfare. They both tell us essentially that it's fairly as late as the 20s that the English start explicitly commanding at least their troops in determinate battles to dismount. Right? These are the years of Edward III. As we've explained, this gradual development of the so-called English tactics of the 100 Years' War, I call them, in fact, the tactics of Edward III, because they developed under Edward I, Edward II, Edward III, witnesses properly the full maturity of the same, and essentially from there on, the English keep on fighting like that. Edward III's reign, we still have to make a very beautiful video or a series of videos about that. We talked a lot about Edward I, but Edward III not just has a pretty long reign, but one straddling the mid-14th century crisis. So what we said before regarding the shrinking of the armies, their professionalization, the fact that tendentially the terrain became proportionally more important, also adds up to this. It adds up, as we've seen, to the greater proportion of longbowmen, their professionalization. And so more or less, again, regardless of individual autocrats, reformers, armies just developed by themselves. All right, there was surely an important political vision behind this. You cannot understand why English armies were so good if you don't understand how good the English state actually was at the time of Edward III. That is conditio sine qua non, right, for being militarily effective, which in this sense barely has anything to do with tactics per se, but just the quality of the army as well. However, it's also something that these armies sort of become, right? And so also other European armies become more tendentially similar to these. Times go on. Froissart describes the English at the smaller clash at Nogent-sur-Seine. We are in 1359, noting that, quote, they kept so closely together that they could not be broken, right? This, of course, looking at the English heavy infantry in defense, which is essentially what you're pursuing right there. Like you're standing your ground as a battle line in defense. Somebody tries to break through, and again, this is what basically the French try to do with the smashing power of cavalry that is not to be thrown away because it's insane, right? We will see how in different battles the English managed to pull off this major feat of defeating the French in that way. As we've seen in the Battle of Poitiers, the French already dismounted themselves at some point. So what was the difference there, even between English and French tactics to begin with? It depends on terrain. For example, if you defend on very bad terrain, the enemy attacks you, and there you also have to explain why the two sides attack or not. And this is not a tactical, so much of a tactical reason. It is a strategical one, right? It has to do with the consistency of both forces, but primarily the objective of the campaign. Why is one standing their ground somewhere and the other attacking? After all, you're giving the initiative to the enemy and by defending, so you're actually declaring that you're the weaker side. You can, of course, achieve a victory in defense, but as we've seen also in von Clausewitz's von Kriege and theory, like we are very well explicitly explained that you defend just to obtain a tactical advantage that you must respend in a counterattack. Otherwise, you cannot simply pursue the enemy. For example, at Agincourt, this was an issue for the English that at some point, for example, slaughtered their own prisoners because they thought that the French were still around, and they had taken so many of them that they didn't know what to do with them. They had to manage still the battlefield, and they end up even losing that kind of opportunity, right? Not having a consistent cavalry body and spending your entire forces in defense so that you can even mount them, but in very scarce forces to pursue the enemy. It's not even just also broader advantage, right? So there are pros and cons to this. So the reason why we rightly appreciate the English is that they managed to win in actually desperate conditions, which makes it all the more spectacular, like exceptional in many ways. But it doesn't change, in fact, the broader strategic context. And in certain cases, in fact, it prevents them even to fully exploit their victory. This is especially actually the case. Like they managed to really do great after Poitiers, after Agincourt. Those victories really open major strategic avenues for the English. At some point, they basically take over half of France, right? So they really earned that into that battle, through that battle, and through those tactics, right? But other times, it's not even also so dynamic. There are certain situations in which you manage to fence the enemy attacks and off, and still not having the strength to ensure the enemy's full annihilation. This again entirely depends, so do not consider it in a broader sense. Just look at what the actual context of every battle is and what happened before and after that. So even in this aspect, the fact that the English were thickly compact is pointed out by the sources because they managed to hold, but it's also something pretty standard that other battle lines really do. In fact, at the combat of the 30, the other famous clash, the Anglo-Bretons stood shoulder to shoulder so tightly that the French could not penetrate their ranks. So it's not that they simply stood there, but they were forced to abandon their position, and they managed to remain that tightly compact because they fought through that. So it's not even there a matter of compactness just per se, is that they were very good fighters and they managed to pull that off. As for formation depth at Azincourt, the English arranged themselves 4 ranks deep, but this is also relatively debatable, right? It's not like we have the full proof of how deep these ranks really were. In fact, deeper formations were likely employed when more troops were available to begin with. It all depends on the front, on how consistent the enemy is. You can't make the maths of that. Also, regarding that, we can say that the French armies, like any other in Europe, fought with some conventional depth, and if situations were allowing it, it could even be deeper at some point or thinner, depending also what you wanted to do with your army. But to mathematically presume that there was any asymmetry between the two in a consistent way doesn't lead anywhere. Like, we have to distinguish the anecdote about one battle, as we can do it now, from the fact that most of the times, not just we do not know anything about the other battles regarding that, but that even for that single anecdote, maybe that source says that, but maybe it wasn't even true. All right. And so if things do not repeat themselves consistently, and there are much bigger factors, as is always the case, for which this battle's outcome was produced, what do we even care about what that source says for all the battles of the 100 Years' War? In that instance, we're saying that the English were forward. Of course, Azincourt was very important, but again, did that really happen? Were the English were, again, outnumbered, they had issues in the way they deployed, but they also were very loaded. They forced the French basically to attack them, and so again, the fact that we're 4 ranks deep may reflect that kind of desperation, together with, okay, we're still enough, however, to hold the line because we really got it. And that's how they, in fact, managed to hold it. But other than that, is there any reason to think that the English or the French fought in any different way than that? Absolutely not. The French dismounted their men-at-arms in the 1340s. We'll talk more about the French countermeasures to English tactics during the 100 Years' War in a later episode of this. But just for the record, again, this is the beginning of the 100 Years' War. So it's not novel for the French to dismount their men-at-arms as well at all, because at large, they would have done it. It would have not been the first time the French did that in their medieval warfare, nor it was something so dramatically unusual. I would stress the years here. If you know the political and social situation in Europe, the 1340s are pretty bad time, right? Even before the Black Death, there's been a major crisis already kicking in, mostly from the mid-20s. So, for whichever reason, this shrinking of the battlefields, this sort of even literally loss in offensive spirit, the sort of moral exhaustion it may have brought across the continent to dismount more frequently. This is actually a viable explanation in a broader philosophical sense. We see Saint-Paul de Leon apparently being the first instance of this French shift towards foot men-at-arms dismounting. Say, Baker reports that at Poitiers, that again we have seen in fair detail, where remaining mounted might have been advantageous, the French dismounted on the advice, of whom? We talked about it in the video, of a Scottish knight in their ranks, which is a sort of ironic twist, also because the French lost, in fact, very badly as well, but likely that was actually as likely as we've seen the more competent thing to do. The reason why the French lost was some possible issue in command and some wrong decision in the battle line leaders, some, again, individual screwing up at the higher level. We don't even know technically what happened to all the French battle lines, because guess what? We don't even know precisely through the sources what actually happened among all four of them, right? We just know that the English at the last line, one of the king, John II, would end up captured, were literally like exhausted. That was their last stand. If they managed to win, that as they did, they won. If they had lost, they would have lost, right? And so that tells you also how level the actual quality of these forces really was. Despite the acknowledged tactical benefits of a charging horseman, notably his capacity to simply smash into the enemy line, so inducing fear, panic, and flight among especially foot soldiers, cavalry saw little use in battles in France or England after this period. Again, the reasons are many. They may not technically be doctrinal in nature. It's part of a broader political and social change that reflects in the strategic and operational circumstances, so that tactics adapt to this rather than being something forced, right? Some very interesting things are occurring, including, as we've seen, the lack of a substantial, for example, heavy infantry support on the wings. This may have contributed, for example, for the dismounting of the men-at-arms as a general way, because because the missile element may have not been, in fact, enough to ensure that enveloping capacity, because as we've seen, they were mostly just like light infantrymen. So you just throwing just this heavy cavalry against the enemy lines, like at Crécy, could end in some complication, especially when armies were quite big, not fully uniformed and reformed, as the French started at the beginning of the war, by also continuously improving throughout the same. So we have seen the enormous effort that the French monarchy had done to regularize their forces after the Leviathanic booming that the French power had achieved during the 13th century. So in many ways, when you look at the English victories of the 100 Years' War, it's much like a tactical issue. It's this sort of better regulated, smaller, better, sort of, in some cases, led and organized power that manages to exploit the crisis of a much bigger system, like the French one, by entering the gaps where things had not been working that well, right? And eventually, the French sort of managed to maintain the fundamentals of their power, to come back to convince, essentially, the people involved in the struggle that they are the stronger, and ultimately winning the war in spite of all these English victories. Regarding cavalry, as we said before, it's well acknowledged that this arm witnessed a resurgence during the 15th century, also during the 100 Years' War. So that things, again, began in that sort of more foot-based direction, paradoxically, at the beginning, rather than in the later period. Some people offer a technologistic answer for this, that is to say, the introduction of the arête de cuirasse, which was basically a device enhancing the lance's rigidity upon impact. This is a nonsensical, deterministic, and technologistic answer. It has nothing to do with that. It has basically to do with the recovery of the great, of medieval civilization after the shock of the first decades after the Black Death. So more professional troops, more troops in general, and obviously the dominance of cavalry over infantry at that point. And by cavalry, we also truly mean men-at-arms, so that even if these guys dismounted at some point, as the English case shows, they can prevail, but still, again, if you can't use an impacting cavalry charge to try to dismantle that enemy resistance with proper combined arm tactics, you can't hope to succeed. After all, we have seen in different encounters, also later on, the Battle of Formigny, etc., that this is obvious. I mean, cavalry is there. It's used by everybody in Western Europe. Nobody thinks to do without, not even the English men-at-arms, that when they can, they actually fight on horseback, as they were pretty darn good in that way, just like all European men-at-arms. Again, the English used cavalry, especially during their raids. They even had, of course, the same longbowmen mounted, famously enough, and even less something connected with, this is the same level of, cavalry improved because stirrups were introduced, right? It's just not realizing the entire roots in cavalry development, the massive political and social reasons why this was happening. Regardless of whether they fought mounted or on foot upon arriving at the battlefield, heavy cavalry remained the backbone of most European armies during this era. English men-at-arms were positioned, as we noted earlier, with groups of archers on their flanks. This formation was first documented in a broader fashion at Duplin Moor in 1332. It's not like the English didn't use this before. Again, we have a wide set of evidence, of hints mostly, regarding the fact that by the 13th century, basically all Western European armies fought with wings, infantry wings on their flanks. So the fact that we can fully and explicitly document this is also particularly not strange. Again, some of the biggest battles, for example, of the year, like Tagliacozzo, Benevent, Markfeld, these were the largest feudal battles of the year. They had the largest amount of knights ever. We know that from the sources of the campaigns, etc., that infantrymen were there, but nobody talks about the infantry in the battle description, mostly because the sources came from a feudal background. And in England, even the clashes with Scotland, because it's not like they're overly documented, right? And in general, you have to arrive to this towards the mid-14th century, even for historiography, to develop to a point that is sort of more detailed, paradoxically. I explained this, that while we know we have more, we have more information about later medieval warfare, we do not necessarily have a better tactical understanding, right? If you study the sources of the later period, especially the 15th century, like, you realize that they're much less insightful than the ones, say, of the early 14th century, for different reasons, including the collapse of medieval, of the shrinking of medieval civilization from the mid-14th century. That paradoxically brought more people to have a more contemplative life, but also, in fact, more detached from the actual action-based one. In fact, tendentially, Renaissance sources are more detached from the battlefield proper, and for medieval England, even socially, we do not have this enormous civic participation in the political and military affairs, unlike, I don't know, in other countries where you literally have chroniclers that knew everything about what, say, the city-state did, what kind of battles were fought, because they literally spoke to the same people who really fought in that in a sort of republican context. It's a bit complicated now to digress on that, but just for saying that if we know that apparently this archer's wings are first documented in English warfare, even assuming that this is true, I would have to double check. For Dublin Moor in 1332, we're pretty sure that this wasn't the first time that the English did that, nor that there was ever a first time, telling the truth, because we don't even know how back in time this practice dated. And probably was very old. It's just we don't have enough information to sort that out, right? It's thought, for example, I don't know, that Richard Lionheart used the peasant crossbowmen, the Italian crossbowmen, at the Battle of Arsuf on the flanks of the Crusader Knights. We don't have an explicit proof, but that makes sense in the way medieval armies would deploy, right? We know, by the way, that this tactics at Dublin Moor was so, this deployment, this array formation at Dublin Moor was so successful that it was replicated by the English at Alladon Hill the following year. A key difference, however, was that instead of a single formation, the army was organized this time in 3 divisions. In fact, the conventional 3 battles of medieval armies, of the big medieval armies of the late 13th, the first half of the 14th century. In this sense, the English are that, the proof of that well-advanced military culture. This is also completely normal, right? And each of these battle lines was supported by its own archer units. Some say this forward-angled ones, but it, again, does not make any sense because these wings, again, were too close on the enemy when they managed to overcome the enemy wings or the enemy flanks, right? The enemy would simply deploy in a way that could simply be outflanked. There were certain circumstances if you closed yourself in a circle like that, but when we talk about these big battles, this did not happen. So the idea that these units would be forward angled is nonsensical, because why? You're basically even offering the enemy an asymmetrical deployment so that they can't exploit, because they're well frontally deployed. Why do you have to forward angle some units, especially of such mobile forces like archers that do not even have properly a deployment? They act in loose formation. They can move, and in fact, we know from different battles that they went back and forth. They even pulled back at some point where they were broken at some point by the enemy, and then they came back also later as a sort of rabble without even a battle formation, a battle line, to just overwhelm with numbers, or at least to attack the enemy with from the flanks. That is a psychologically devastating tactics, regardless of who carries that out. Even this sort of light infantry that is not that relevant. These units were, even for their own safety and the general symmetry of the formation, much better off like advancing in parallel to the battle line. And if they had the chance to outflank the enemy, to do so, but to assume that they would be forward angled in this sense just by the foe, even when they were defending, doesn't make any sense, right? It's conceptually very dumb, because the enemy can at that point outflank you if you're forward angled with his own wings. So the notion that simply the enemy entered this chamber of death, being shot from the sides without having his own side, it defies the logic of basically every army, not just the general symmetry of armies of the time, but the fact that this was such a basic and obvious tactic that obviously was paralleled by an enemy that would use wings himself. So it doesn't, again, make any sense. And you still find the stuff published like that there was a predisposition in this forward angle fashion. No, right? These were extremely flexible lines, especially if they were composed by just by missile troops that act in loose formation and can go back and forth. They don't even have to care about who is in the front or not. And by the way, there are many instances in Western European warfare of enormous, even thousands strong heavy infantry wings that attacked. They were pretty well aligned with the cavalry battle lines that advanced. They fought against their counterparts, and then they could close on the enemy without any problem, without needing any forward angled predisposition. All right, this is really a modernistic presumption that does not really find any particular evidence to have been used in the art of war of the era. Right? So the myth of the hearse stems from this too, right? It's not, again, that there may be some circumstances when terrain allows it, for example, for which you can have some troops deployed, I don't know, in a forward angled formation. Say you're at the bottom of a valley, and in the surroundings there are some heights with some forests. So you can maybe deploy, in this sense, archers on top of that, but it's a sort of an ideal situation, right? And the enemy will maybe still find a countermeasure in that sense. Thus, nothing special about this either. We find it in other European armies. There is nothing typical of the 100 Years' War about this. This is another very common mistake. It's not anything typically English either. So, again, natural defenses were very important. It's not to say they weren't exploited, and that they would tend to this kind of bottling of the enemy in this sort of trap. But again, when you look at major battles and how this in smaller battles you can obtain actually more results, right? The odds are less balanced. You can have weird situations in Rambo style performances from even individuals. But in bigger battles, even terrain features, as we explained with the larger armies, are going to be less relevant, as a matter of fact. I mean, at large, they can cause more disorder in certain situation, but at the same time they can be surpassed more easily. And so it's not much the terrain feature that creates any problem. Also because but the enemy that does. Also in defense, like in this English case, it's not like, as we've seen, being behind a specific obstacle is particularly conducive to a greater outcome, especially in the moment in which you have to counterattack, right? So if anything, things are much more composite. We've seen reading the battlefield is also not easy because we do not know very often where precisely battles were fought, how the battlefield looked like at the time. We have scattered info. There are different debates on how, again, where this happened. We looked at it at Poitiers, right? And major, say, frontal clashes mostly follow terrain that is more or less conventionally assailable. Real genius, or at least very good tactics entail flank attacks with concealed reserves. That is something a bit more different, and it's not these wing attacks, right? It's literally like a pocket of troops, like as we've seen Capital the book at Poitiers. That was this desperate force that had basically to either win or lose all the battle, that outflanked the French in a very broader space, detaching from the main formation. So really having nothing to do with this battle line and wings combination, right? Never make that mistake. It's also a very conceptual, strategic fundamental, right? We're looking at it, how you use your forces. Nothing is so, for example, cramped and overly complicated. Especially in bigger battles, things are as straightforward as they get. And they usually revolve, again, on this different multiple lines alternation and flank attacks both. This is how battles were won or lost, regardless also who was mounted or dismounted, whatever. Wanting to factorialize this into the decisive element here was the archers, that you have literally no evidence whatsoever that you can positively bring to the table. First of all, in a strictly absolute sense, there's no way to mathematically calculate that. On top of it, sources actually tell you that battles were won for other reasons. All right, so just some problems in these battle lines or whatever. And even when we hear of this unit, I don't know, taking hits from arrows or whatever, it's not obviously per se what changed the iceberg below. Like, it may be the tip of the iceberg, but the bulk of the strategic quantity is the battle lines of heavies that clash against one another, dismounted or mounted alike. There are these other measures, for example, small pits dug in front as additional defense. This, again, was used throughout all warfare, right? Rendering the terrain more accidented, making it more difficult for the enemy. Again, if say battles could simply be won by these things, everybody would have done it, right? And again, as I said before, you can't simply even predict where you will actually fight, if the enemy will attack or not, who does what. Think about Azincourt is such a great example, because basically the French simply sit there and say, okay, we'll just starve you, and the English advance and start harassing the French with their archers, and for some reason that they couldn't answer well with their crossbowmen enough, so they decided to attack, but they were outnumbered. There are so many different factors that, again, in there alone, if you do not know the quantity of, you can't even properly say whether they were the more relevant or not. It's just how the story followed, but the battle per se, like, where's the moral element to all this of the two? How do you measure even that? Von Clausewitz is quite explicit about the difficulty, even from the side of those who participated to the battle, to determine what actually happened in that battle. In fact, if you, read all the battle accounts of Azincourt, including the eyewitness, one of the people who were there, it's not like they actually tell you what happened. It's not that they actually explain you how the battle as a whole went. I mean, they do. In their narrative, they try to tell you what happened in general, not even necessarily explaining all the passages, which was normal to them in their literary purpose. But the accounts are relatively conflicting in ways that maybe altogether they are coherent, but that they show you how things went in a direction mostly for some bigger reason that has to do with that strategic force involved in combat rather than any other detail about that pit, that stake, what the archers did, whatever. That's very, 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 very important. And just every battle is so different, and these accounts are so, in fact, unique in whatever they say. I mean, they're similar to one another in general, in a broader literary sense. But again, just a person studying the entirety of 100 years' worth battles from every single account that exists can sort of have a grasp of the broader picture. And tendentially, the more you go towards that direction, the more you realize that these battles were hardly fought, and that it's just, there's just barely a thread uniting, for example, this sequence of English victories that surely derived from a better English military system, but that in fact do not pass necessarily through, again, especially the idea that the longbow was so special or whatever. You have, for example, some scholars believe that the practice of digging small pits in front of the battle lines was a technique likely borrowed from the Scots as well. So why didn't the Scots defeat everybody or develop the special military system? Because it's not like Scotland went, yes, it managed to win, of course, her independence, her full feudal affirmation as a state, etc. But you can't look at Scotland and say, okay, my God, these were such a most advanced military system in Europe. Why would the English, for example, even if it were true that they needed to copy this from the Scots, which, again, probably these pits were dug by everybody normally, there were people who were in armies all over Europe that were properly deputed to prepare the battlefield, mostly actually to open it wide for cavalry charges rather than digging in. But there are these instances of also, of course, across the continent as well. But if anything, it's just one thing that helped the English that probably were good at even exploiting this stuff, but it were just like the little help, the few points percentage in the bigger picture of why they managed to win battles. And so, again, nothing also in here specifically English in it. Baker describes how at Crécy, the English, quote, dug a large number of pits in the ground near their front line, each a foot deep and a foot wide, so that if the French cavalry approached, their horses would stumble in the pits. Nobody ever thought about that, of course. Like, you can simply dig pits and you stop, you make cavalry stumble. Oh my God, a millennia of cavalry warfare. Now we discovered this. Obviously, this did not happen. They would dig these pits, but obviously they would not stop the advance of French cavalry charges. You could slow them down a bit. You could bog them down a bit. But again, the main French battle lines would advance and would reach the English lines, disordered, softened up disordered by the archery fire from the flanks, whatever. But still arriving. Like, there is no, in the art of war in here, there is no way to stop an enemy battle line unless you have a castle in between, and not even that is going to stop the enemy from assailing you, but in fact yet another battle line. And that's how all armies fought in that way, right? If simple field fortifications would have been the game changer, everybody would have simply entrenched. We would have had World War I ante litteram. And as we know, not even in World War I, trenches were a cause, but rather a consequence of a strategic stalemate that derived from the broader national powers of the forces involved, which is a very different thing from, again, World War I was fought like this because of machine guns and shells. No, right? It's just a Western front, and for a specific political and strategical reason. We see this, because, by the way, field fortifications are something that does increase a lot in late medieval warfare. We've seen it in different places. We've seen it in, for example, in Italian battlefields, at the Battle of Molinella, the Battle of Caravaggio, and this was really typical, right? We saw the Battle of Formigny as well, which shows how this practice persisted into the 100 Years' War's final stages. Everybody in Europe used this. Again, armies are, especially towards the mid-15th century, not that smaller than before, but still smaller. And again, they invested more in entrenchment. Infantry was also strengthening a little bit more. So there are different reasons why this happened. There was more artillery around. So this is also completely normal. And there's nothing specific about the 100 Years' War, the English or the French, if this particularly happened. So this is also in line with the Western art of war. Little mention here about of the term herce. Again, I will make a specific video to debunk the myth of the herce as this dragon teeth kind of zigzag battle line with pockets of, kunai, of wedges of archers in front of the men-at-arms battle line. The herce simply represents a fork with just two tips right at the line that are the wings, right? And you have, if you're familiar with 100 Years War books, etc., you know how for a long time there was this obsession to show you the diagram of how the battle line with the herce really meant, all the explanation. This is complete modernistic, secularistic mental jerk-off, right? There was none of that as far as we're concerned. The herce simply means this is like a fork, and so it's just this herce is this peasant working tool used at the time that rendered you the idea of what the formation was like. And so it's used by the chroniclers of the time for this reason. And again, the wedge-shaped arrangement of the English archers doesn't make any sense. It's micro-tactical relativism. Combined armed tactics relied on concentrated masses of troops, especially as simply deployed. So the battle line of heavy infantrymen, the wings of archers, this is the best thing you can use. The notion that you would be stronger if you intersperse the archers in between or in front, even of the battle line, it's complete nonsense. That's actually a terrible way to use archers. That would not be effective. Consider that archery there worked not in the small unit tactics, but with massive volleys that were cadenced, by the way, in a way that were not necessarily even more effective if with this great rapidity of fire. This was true, like if you could maintain at least an orderly volley sequence, all right? But in any case, that's more punching and more effective against an enemy formation if it's performed by a bigger formation. That is going to be best if it is enough collectively trained to do this repeatedly in more or less an orderly fashion. Then things would become more complicated during the battle. The system decays, entropy, disorder, chaos. Reason for which you don't want to intersperse wedges of archers in between men-at-arms battle lines that do not really bring to anything useful. Froissart uses the term herce for the English formation at Crécy. The etymology is, again, probably connected from this continental harrow. And so there are other explanations have been provided, like the French term herce, meaning a bristly fence or hedgehog, but that's not necessarily the thing. It could definitely entail, by the way, that aside from this etymology, that would be, as we've seen, this other sort of field, fortifications, but it's another thing. And there is another French chronicle that portrays the archers at Crécy arranged in the shape of a shield, which is sort of an ambiguous term. It probably means like in this curved sense, like so with this two-pronged formation. That, by the way, was fairly common. Like there are in because these guys would, as we've seen, advance at some point on the wings. They could even be prearranged, as we said before, with if the terrain allowed or enemy wings allowed, in this sort of more advanced fashion, but not again in a sort of more complicated way. And in fact, one of the errors to make is especially to follow Renaissance sources that are objectively terrible, and have literally, from a mental point of view, nothing to do with the beautiful medieval ones of the era. In fact, writing in 1590, you have Sir John Smith offering an insight in his hope, at least, that was that is in fact erroneous. He even thought, for example, that a hearse consisted of a single wing rather than two adjacent. One, he writes this as, quote, broad in front and narrow in flank, as, for example, if it were 25, 30, 35 or more archers in front, the flanks did not consist but of 7 or 8 ranks at the most. And the reason was this, that if they had placed any more ranks than 7 or 8, the hind ranks of archers would have lost a great deal of ground in the volleys of their arrows at their enemies. Also, at the side of the hind ranks would have been in there so many former ranks. So this is actually just a delirium. He says that such herces, he spells it like H-E-R-R-S-E-S, herce, otherwise it's H-E-R-C-E, were positioned, quote, either before the front of the armed footmen or else in wings upon the corners of their battles. So he is the one that actually here oriented also modern scholarship in thinking, presuming that he knew anything about this, like in the front of their footmen, may simply mean, as it happened in other contexts, that of course there could be a screen of archers in the front. This happened especially in moments where either the enemy was lining up, the enemy's lights skirmished against one another. This did happen, by the way, it happened in many instances, but as you understand, it's not really the typical pitched battle formation. It would follow in the later bigger combat. By the way, in the Renaissance, this happened too, with different screens of troops doing different things depending on the tactical situations. Of course, during the 100 Years' War, we can imagine this stuff having happened, but again, the notion of would be wedges of archers in front of the men-at-arms, like it doesn't find any corroboration. Here the source says that these archers could be sometimes both in front and wings, and again, we do not have any evidence of this. Also because in the front, these troops would have been wasted. We've seen, for example, the French at Courtrai used their crossbowmen against the Flemish because those had a stationary position. They didn't have cavalry. The crossbowmen shot from across the channel, so in that case you can't do it. It's a stationary target. You're not threatened. You send the crossbows to harass them. It's the typically advantageous situation. You can use missile forces in that way, but of course the crossbowmen get the hell out of the way when the French knights have to advance. There are anecdotes about the Genoese crossbowmen sent ahead in a similar fashion at Herce by the French that would have also allegedly run over them later because they disliked the fact that they were commoners. That's also probably not what happened. In any case, these are mostly anecdotes. I would point out, as we've seen, for example, in the video about Froissart, that you can't even really trust certain sources. Froissart was writing courtly literature. He wasn't so interested in describing what actually happened on the battlefield. So some are anecdotes, some are almost like novels, like something between say a myth and reality that mostly had to land somewhere in some say valorial or sort of fantasy sense, rather than, it's not to say that these things do not mean something that really happened in their view or that refer to something that they had heard and that they sort of reinterpreted, but they're not, again, what specifically happened when you especially start studying how different armies fought. And because these accounts are also, I don't know how to say that, but even if they are inconsistent, if they are sort of in contrast with one another on certain things, overall, they're not devoid of military logic, right? So there are certain details, right, that are debatable, but the core of what may have practically happened is not really beyond belief, right? Except it makes you really worry about specific details, specific notions, specific episodes, especially when one source, like, for example, the episode of the Genoese at Crécy, that were also kept in use by the French very often later on. So not really proving that they were bad against their English counterparts, nor that there was anything wrong with them, that make you think, that make you really aware that not everything that is said here is necessary to be told literally, right? Or as, that source said that, so it's history, right? And that's not how it works. Like, we exist as historians to critically interpret sources, which is not, like people say, if you cite things, you're more professional. No, that's just for uneducated people who do not even know what historical research is, right? You must use military logic, providing with evidence, but also making sense to begin with. There's also this other notion that enemy troops shielding themselves from the onslaught of arrows tended to veer away from the archers, funneling them towards the awaiting men-at-arms, which is, as we explained, actually not a thing. Like, normally battle lines were parallel against one another. They used missile wings at the same time. Of course, if you're, say, for example, the English longbowmen in defense have knocked out the French crossbowmen that have fled from the field. And sometimes the English longbowmen themselves withdrew. Of course, you're advancing, say, without the support of crossbowmen. By the way, you have to consider there whether the longbowmen had spent themselves. We'll talk about this in a second episode, because it was extremely exhausting. Everybody was incredibly under pressure here. If you say, again, these English archers are, shooting you from the flanks, first of all, like, we do not know what really happened. Like, if you, of course, it was important to be very determined in the attack, and so you would have advanced nevertheless. But say, if you could, for example, stay a bit more at a distance before the English archers shot, because again, it's not like we're immediately on your flank, right? It's more like if you assume this V-shaped tunnel of death, it's not like you're literally entering like a column with the English longbowmen deployed in line on your side, targeting everywhere. Like again, especially the bigger the engagement is, the least this is how it really happens. What actually happened, which was much more concrete in strictly military terms, is that when you came to fight against the men-at-arms, because it's sort of stupid to think that you would funnel yourself towards the awaiting men-at-arms just because, you were to advance against the men-at-arms. Also, units maintain a certain cohesion. Yes, it's at times they could be more disordered, but in general, again, light troops do not scathe the consistency of a battle line of heavies. All right, these engage normally. It's completely normal in all medieval warfare on a regular basis. What happens concretely is that when these two battle lines meet and fight, if one is uncovered on the flanks, the enemy flanks can close on their flanks. So they could target them with the same arrows at close range, for example. It could be devastating because some, shots of longbow use, they had, of course, different arrow types, sometimes also to damage armor, but in general, the best armor was designed to withstand also the blows. In fact, very few arrows would actually cause any relevant damage to the men-at-arms to begin with. You could disorder them, you could bombard them, you could shatter them in some way. Yes, you could disorder the broader formation, especially cavalry, as the horses were more vulnerable. But in general, again, the notion that the longbowmen stopped as archers the enemy heavies, this is not a thing, all right? This is not a thing for the English, as it's not a thing for anyone in Europe and anywhere else. That's why they're missile, right? That's why they're light. They can't do that, right? Otherwise it would be in something else. But they can attack from the flank, even as light troops, either targeting the enemy that way, but mostly also just passing to their, warhammers, to swords that also start becoming relatively cheap for these lesser troops in the mid-14th century, and engaging them. And at that level, what matters strategically is just the psychological impact of a flank attack. So all this notion that they have to explain to you how it happened, look at here, like, because this unit tended to wheel in this way, because now I show you on the map. It's complete BS, right? If anyone is trying to explain to you warfare in that way, it's just the first indicator they know absolutely nothing about how medieval warfare works or how warfare works in general, right? So nobody's like an idiot that gets into a condition of inferiority just per se, without any reason, right? So enfilading fire is theoretically possible, but again, by which degree? I do not know any battle in which there was, a 90 degrees angle between the main battle line and the wings, the archer wings, so the enemy entered and lets itself being shot by enfilade fire like that, right? This is sort of wishful thinking. What actually happened is when the enemy was engaged in hand-to-hand combat in the main line of contact, the wings, if they were free from their counterparts could close on the enemy. And that, in fact, was not the normal situation. You would take measures for that. If you didn't have wings, you wouldn't go for it. All right. This happened everywhere in Europe. There's plenty of, basically all sort of the battle tactics of the time worked in this sense. And consider that, of course, it took time. Like maybe your battle line was crushed before you could close the wings on the enemy. And if the battle line was crushed, the wings were done for. All right, it's not like they could save the situation. They're completely done. So this positivistic idiocy that this was a genius tactics that nobody used, that it was so effective, allowed to win, it's a pile of horse blip. All right, it's not present anywhere in the entire medieval historiography. That, of course, deals with much more obvious, accurate, and objective and macroscopical reasons why battles were won or lost. Geoffrey Le Baker explicitly states that by positioning archers on the wings of each battle, they, quote, did not hinder the men-at-arms, nor did they meet the enemy head-on, but could catch them in their crossfire, yes. But if they could get there, right? So that's a completely different thing. And the French had those wings, and they really always had them in their history, right? And the fact that the archers were not animated dummies and they could move is also completely normal, because they are light infantry that, since the dawn of warfare, operates in loose formation and can move back and forth without any particular problem. Because they are weaker, by the way. It's not because they are special and they can win battles like that, because they always act on combined arms and they have that specific advantage. And it's not normal for an enemy to advance without covered flanks, right? Nor for the battle to fundamentally revolve around that. All right, the battle revolves around what happens in the center between the heavies that decide matters, with the support of again, the wings of the auxiliary forces, but still mostly on their own. Also, there are some scholars that said, what these archers actually did was advancing and then withdrawing on a regular basis to lure the enemy. Sometimes that could happen, but more often than not, as we've seen, for example, at Azincourt, it was just like the entire battle line that moved ahead. Also, because what's the point of trying, especially in the side of cavalry, to expose your archers that are so vulnerable? Plus, you have to decide: did they use the pits or the stakes or not? Right? If they move ahead, those were useless, and if they fell back on that, they could have achieved that. But the question is also, to what end? Would an enemy just respond the way they hope? Right? This doesn't even take into account the fact that we do not really know what kind of damage, for example, these arrows could inflict in a broader sense. We know that Azincourt, that is very famous, it's so sort of iconic. Also, as far as the sources are concerned, that, of course, the French responded, but they could have responded for different reasons. Maybe because they were morally loaded, because they didn't want to take losses, they had to react in some way. That's a broader strategic principle as well. But was merely that thing that made things succeed? Because again, for example, about that battle, the general narrative is that the French had cavalry wings with which they attacked the English longbow wings, and they got defeated by that. And everybody says, "Oh my God, the English longbows stopped cavalry. It was so strong. They did so with stakes, and then the enemies didn't even arrive." We actually know the French charged and arrived there and engaged with longbowmen armed not just with longbows, but with actual melee weapons, which doesn't quite make them just longbowmen, by the way. Plus, other sources, famous sources of the same battle, tells us that those French wings were radically understrength before the engagement, and that they engaged in a sort of bad way. They took losses in a combat that they performed, reaching the English longbowmen that evidently couldn't stop them just with their archers, with their arrows, as it's obvious, just like in any, again, context of cavalry versus light infantry, especially heavy cavalry versus light infantry. And it turns out this wasn't just light infantry, but they had also heavy capacities when they were to be met. So even because, by the way, as I said before, normally in other armies, wings were constituted by heavy infantry. This was the normality, because historically the center, the men-at-arms, was constituted by knights. So it's true that, as we explained, after the mid-14th century, heavy infantry decays, especially the commoners one, etc., and so you have more archers on the wings. So this perfectly fits the situation. Also, the men-at-arms that dismount, and so we are there, right? But it was still possible and normal that you could have heavy infantry in the wings. And so something that would evenly be able to take on the enemy, even just into hand-to-hand combat. Even light infantry has some capacity when you outflank the enemy, attack it from the flank. And as we've seen here at Azincourt, for example, eventually, they weren't just light infantry. The French were under strength. That's an important thing, all right? So that's more a problem of French organization than the performance of the longbowmen in that context. So it's, as you understand, there is no reason to call into play who knows which magical factors that you have to be amazed at to explain how a battle was fought and why the outcome was the way that it was. So I fortunately see that this video is tremendously long, because whenever I discuss these topics, I never lack, let's say, ideas and thoughts. And as you understand, this happens for a reason, to say the least. In the next episodes, I will discuss, first of all, the longbowmen, to follow the notion that, in fact, longbowmen are sort of overrated in general, in absolute and in relative terms in the English armies and in the general context of the 100 Years' War. Not that they weren't good, again, individually as soldiers, whatever, but again, they're still light infantry, and they still work like light infantry has always worked in all the art of war. And then we'll talk about the men-at-arms that are a bit like maybe not the unsung heroes in general. I mean, they were the cooler guys that really halted the French cavalry charges that took most of the blow, and that for reasons that, as you understand, are very modernistic in nature. Not because people today have been convinced that the average person, the commoner, is the good guy, etc. They do not accept that the system was run by this nobleman, and so there is something here which should be a bit more correctly evaluated. Once you get the fundamentals right, it's not that difficult. Like just what I said in this video, for example, just a couple of hours. I know it's long for a YouTube video, but this would be enough. Like if everybody knew the stuff, like if they could, if anything, even dialectically argument the topic in this way, with these few notions at the end of the day, everything would be so clear. We would be able to interpret medieval warfare in a much more natural, easy, obvious way. We wouldn't have any broader issue, and probably we would appreciate medieval English warfare much more than we already do. Right? If you deal with instead the same topic with these guys had the magical formation, the best tactics nobody had, because they had sorted out some kind of weird geometrical game on the battlefield and everybody else was stupid. Haha, you're actually undermining the value of the English armies of the 100 Years' War. It was incredibly high. And, English armies of the 100 Years' War, again, are very cool, are amazing. I love them. And I want to make more videos about... Again, in the video about the Battle of Poitiers, you can see the utter love that I have towards probably the English armies in that sense. I like very much the French ones as well, and I always defend them whenever somebody says they were incompetent, they were dumb, they were just, the noblemen didn't accept people fighting on foot. I mean, they were fighting against other noblemen. The men-at-arms dismounted from the English side for tactical needs, not because they would have not fought mounted had they had the upper hand, right? If, say, the strategic situation at Crécy, at Poitiers, at Azincourt had been the same, say they had switched, like, the English with that numerical advantage, strategic advantage, they would have likely fought in the same identical way in the reverse, all right? The English would have attacked a different, like a Crécy, they would have attacked with cavalry charges, right? They would have, everything, again, would have likely followed the same exact picture in reverse, right? When you get that, you start appreciating more why the difference was made. And this is the purpose of this video. By the way, in the pictures, I inserted stuff also about the English armies of the Wars of the Roses, which I don't know whether I'm going to cover. I have to see this because, again, I have different. I made a video about the tactics of the armies of the Wars of the Roses, by the way. So I don't so I don't have any specific. Let me see if. Oh, okay. No, we'll, however, make another video about the... Okay, so say better. This video is properly about the English tactics of the 100 Years' War, especially pitched battles. And again, we'll talk about the chevauchée and again about the Wars of the Roses and everything. Here, I can still simply, actually, now that I'm recording the video, eliminate the pictures about the Wars of the Roses so that you don't get strange ideas about it, even though they're beautiful, but nevertheless, they have their space, all right? Very well. I was glad to discuss this. We will go on, as promised, hopefully. For today, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.